Hello everyone, my name is Mirna, and on behalf of the Mindalia TV team, we want to welcome you to Mindalia live streaming, where thousands of people around the world gather to see the lectures and interviews organized by Mindalia TV. Today with us, we have Sherry Strong. Sherry is an award-winning speaker, chef, nutritionist, food philosopher. She was the Victorian Chair of Nutrition in Australia, Melbourne. She is president of the Slow Food and the co-founder of the World Wellness Summit. She has worked with elite athletes, billionaires, celebrities, CEOs, and everyday folk like herself to transform the way they relate to food and their body. Without further delay, we're going to introduce you to Sherry, but before, we want to remind you that if you want to help other people like you, like me, to reach or to have access to the knowledge we share in our channel, there's a couple of things you can do. Just by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, or leaving us a positive comment down below, you help us reach to them. And with that, we can raise the level of consciousness around the world. Mindalia TV is a non-profit organization, and our only mission is that, just to share towards as many people in the globe as possible. Also, if you want to participate in this talk, you have the chat on the side of the screen, and you can ask questions to Sherry. Just please remember the format. It's going to be the word question in caps, the place where you're seeing us from, and the actual question you want answered. And without further ado, I'm going to be leaving you now with Sherry. Sherry?
Thank you, Mirna. It's very exciting to be here today. Great. Okay, so today I'm talking about inspired eating, and the title of my talk is How God Wants Us to Eat. And I have to say that when I first signed up to give this presentation, it's based on a book that I'm writing. I was frightened. I was intimidated by the topic, and because the topic has God in the title, I think it comes with a weighty responsibility and a lot of expectations and triggers for people. So what I'd like to do is, today I'm going to tell you about my story and how I've actually come to teach about inspired eating and what I believe is how God wants us to eat, and that contains what we're meant to be eating and the social context and basically all the things that lead to us being confused about humans as humans eating our food. I want to clear that up and show that God communicates to us through nature how it is we're meant to be eating, and there's a very simple way of observing nature and understanding this. He also communicates to us, and I believe in God as our creator, so universal energy, and that has different meanings and different connotations to us. But I believe that this source energies, creator energy, or God communicates to us through us, also in how we're meant to be eating as the human species. And there's many ways that humans eat very different to other species on the planet, although we may share similarities with some. So I'm going to talk about my story. I'm going to also talk about the food philosophies that I have been teaching for over 20 years now, and how they actually came to be, and how they really form the part of an anti-diet philosophy. I wrote a book on it in 2014 called Return to Food, the Life-Changing Anti-Diet. And I then went on to create the Sweet Freedom online program, which is all about helping people end sugar addiction for good. So that then was really much more about the emotional relationship that we had with food, because what I learned is that people were dieting. They had this very intellectual relationship with their food and dieting, being on the planet. And it was only one part of the puzzle, which is one of the reasons why diets have a 95% failure rate, is that they're not natural. They don't work with our true human nature, but they're great opportunities for people to market and sell stuff that doesn't work long term. So the 5% success rate that it does have is usually because people don't have a terribly emotional relationship with food, or they're just on that threshold of anything will actually work because they're ready to make the changes. So I shifted from that really mental place and the philosophical approach, and incorporated that into also understanding the emotional the spiritual reasons why we actually eat in ways that don't serve us or the planet. And that's where I came up with a business called Sweet Freedom, which I'll tell you a little bit about, and how that helps people end sugar addiction for good. And I'm only telling you about this in context to how this works in the entire picture, because I then realized that inspired eating was the next level we needed to get to really connect to not just the physical part of our relationship with food and the emotional part of how we do food, but the spiritual way in which we're connected to what we eat and the planet, and of course to God. And so there is a way that I believe is a way that we can eat as a species that is good for the planet and good for our body, and in a way that our Creator designed us to eat. You know, he created the world, and the world evolved synergistically to meet our needs. And when we are following nature and understanding nature, it fits perfectly. And when we deviate from that, things go awry. And I think that's probably one of the things that's happened is we've gone awry in our relationship with food, and it's created a lot of problems for us. So the other thing I'm going to cover is something that I call the lethal recipe, and that's how we've gone awry with our food system, and talk a little bit about God's plan versus man's plan as far as how we're meant to be eating on the planet, and how I'm going to talk about some of the philosophies about how God speaks to us through nature. And again, how we're meant to eat. So it's not just what or the why or the where, but how we're meant to eat. And then I'm going to leave you with the last part of my time with you tonight with some very definitive action steps that you can take today, that you can start to move to developing a relationship with food, your body, the planet, and God in a way that actually creates harmony in all of those areas. And when you have harmony in all of those areas, you then start to develop a really healthy relationship with food, your body, and the planet. And you will start to see that it impacts every single area of our life. So relationships, obviously, if we're living in an energized and healthy body, it's going to impact us in a healthy way. And even our business, the work that we do in the world. So I'm going to leave you with those simple things that you can take action to today, and a free gift for everyone. I have a program that I sold online for $37. It's videos, audios, and PDFs, and it's really going to help you start to get on this path of inspired eating. Okay, so just to let you know as well, I have a 17-year-old cat. His name's Billy Cart. He's a lilac Burmese, and he's kind of in the last days of life. So if you hear a noise in the background, I'm not torturing a young baby or a child. It is my cat. Okay, so I'd like to get started with the story of how I actually came to do all of this work. And it really started out because I was born an addict. Okay, so I was born addicted to the world's most dangerous drug, according to the chief of health in Amsterdam. He will refer to sugar, refined sugar, as the world's most dangerous drug. And the truth is that although we kind of think it's not that harmful or it's innocuous, or people are exaggerating about it, we now have scientific evidence to show, Dr. Nancy Appleton has done the research to show that it's connected to over 144 diseases and chronic conditions. It is definitely the number one contributor to diabetes, of which the numbers are growing exponentially. As the more sugar we put into our food and the more we process our food like a drug, the more it actually is starting to kill us. And I certainly not only felt the impacts of being pre-diabetic in my later teens and my 20s, but it impacted me in very negative ways, not just physically, but really emotionally. So depression to the point of not wanting to actually live. So my relationship with sugar, being fed baby formula from birth, really became, I think, part of the reason why I do what I do, is that baby food was made with what I call the lethal recipe, refined sugars, oils, chemicals, grains, and things like refined salts and things like MSG. So not the naturally occurring MSG, so the chemically synthesized MSG, which we know is an excitotoxin and a neurotoxin. But of course, I was just one of millions who were fed this baby formula, and millions more since, since its inception. And baby formula can nowhere near compete with what God has created through mother's milk. Mother's milk has over 300 different unique compounds and living, um, uh, it's living foods. It's nourishing, energizing, protective, it's whole, it's so incredibly complex. We're just now starting to understand that even things like a mother can produce milk for her male child different to her female child. So we're just starting to scratch the surface of how complex this food is. So having a baby formula with highly refined ingredients can nowhere compete with human, the nutrition that comes from breast milk. And it's really kind of the start of a deviation of man kind of separating and thinking that they can actually improve on nature. And in fact, my mother was convinced by doctors and nurses in the hospital. She was told that this new baby formula was superior to the breast milk that she produced for her first two children and subsequently her fourth child. So she was also shamed by doctors and nurses. One of the nurses said she was a dirty person for wanting to breastfeed. So there's all kinds of weird things that actually go on in the food system now that create this separation. And ultimately, this separation from nature, from our own nature, from that connection, to the mother. You think about the natural breast and the nipple and that connection close to the heart of a child, to then being replaced with a synthetic or rubber or plastic nipple, in a plastic or even a glass bottle. All of those things take us away from that which can actually be truly nourishing at an intensely formative time. So I guess it's kind of unlikely. I feel like an unlikely teacher in doing this work that I've come about it. And for a lot of my life, although I was fascinated by it, I was curious about our relationship with food and our body, and I loved food from a young age. I really felt that I was an unlikely teacher. I often think of Moses. I remember when I heard that he had a speech impediment. And, part of his work was to be this orator to thousands of people. And I was trying to imagine what that's like. And because I've had a disordered relationship with food for a good portion, certainly the first half of my life, it was severely disordered. First 3 decades, I felt a bit, like trying to be a professional speaker with a speech impediment. It was something, that felt daunting. And who am I to actually be teaching this? So when I moved on into my later years as a child, I would be, eating sugar almost every single day. And that created not only illness in my body, but a depression in my body. And because I had quite a tumultuous childhood, we had a very complicated household, you could say. I was really struggling with my perception of the world. And 11 years old, I remember crying myself to sleep, just thinking about how difficult things are in the world. And that depression and that sadness for what was happening in the world caused me to eat more sugar. And when I went on to finish school, I really felt I wanted to be part of the solution on the planet, not the problem. So even though what I would have loved to have done secretly, not so secretly, but selfishly, was to become a fashion designer or a singer, folk writer, folk singer-songwriter. But I felt I needed to do something that really made the world a better place. And at the time, I sought that out in religion, and I left high school to study to become a missionary. And it wasn't very long into my missionary studies that I just had a deep sense of feeling that this wasn't right for me. There were many aspects about religious life that didn't sit well with me, that I didn't know how to quite reconcile. And so I actually left religious life, and I threw the baby out with the bathwater. So I left spirituality and my relationship with God. I left that as well as leaving religion. And that created a disconnection within me. And it was a disconnection to nature, although I never had a really good connection to nature, I have to say, to source energy. with my own human nature. There were parts of me that I cut off and disowned in that disconnection from religion. And that separation was very painful. And at the time I had moved to Australia, I was living in Australia, and I was disconnected from my family. And I was in a relationship. I was married to a man who I loved deeply, but sadly, for all intents and purposes, he was a very selfish man. And so that exacerbated my loneliness. And that loneliness and that separation continued for about 10 years. And during those 10 years, it was a particularly dark time in my life. I was twice my size. I became a chef. I had a cooking school, and I also became twice my size. So I didn't become 10'4". I didn't have this massive height reduction or height increase and then a reduction. And then I lost the weight. I was struggling with the weight. I tried dieting, and dieting didn't work. So I started to move my body, and I started to explore and start to understand how it was we were meant to be eating. And when I started this cooking school, I was then invited to, as Myrna said, become on the board of Nutrition Australia in Victoria, in Australia at the time. And then I was later invited to become the head of Nutrition Australia, the Victorian chair of Nutrition Australia, not the head of Nutrition Australia. And so I felt a professional obligation to really solve this nutritional confusion issue, which I had, and I knew everyone I spoke to had. Even, the professionals who had studied it for years. There was still so much to learn, and so much confusion, so much discord. There wasn't this harmonious relationship that we have with food and, in our body, and an understanding. And so at that time, I was twice my size. I'm studying nutrition, and I'm at university, and I realize the institution I was studying nutrition at is very political, and it was very industry influenced. And for me, the industry around nutrition was corrupt. It wasn't actually actively interested in what was best and most important for humans. It was what actually had created income for people. And where there was income, it's that thing, that quote by Upton Sinclair. He says, "It's a difficult thing to get a man to understand something upon which his income depends." And I could relate to that, because when I went on to, make my living, to try and make my living as a nutritionist and to help people, with their relationship with food, it was very difficult to make a living. And I remember one time struggling to, I was wondering where my rent was coming from. And so I was, really strapped financially. And I got a phone call from a company wanting me to do a television commercial. And that television commercial paid $120,000 for 2 days' work. And I was so relieved. I was so grateful. And then I found out what the product was. And it was a calcium fortified milk targeted towards children that had refined sugars and chemicals and flavorings in it. So definitely not a good thing. I couldn't do it. But I saw throughout the industry in my position that this happens all the time. What they'll do is they'll find credible people, and they'll celebrate the nutrients in something, or what they perceive to be the benefits, get someone who's credible to promote those benefits, and then they'll get people to have to buy these things that they're making. But it wasn't really good for people, and it certainly wasn't good for the planet either. So I went on a discovery to actually figure out, how is it that we're meant to be eating? What is the truth about nutrition and food, and how we're meant to relate to food and our body and the planet? And at that time, I would go walking in nature. I started to reconnect with nature, and I slowly started to reconnect my relationship with source energy, with the creator. And I would ask for guidance. And one day I was walking in nature, and I asked, there's so much confusion out there. I need a way to explain it to people that it just makes sense. And that's where Nature's Principle came to me. And Nature's Principle is really a piece of helping us understand how we're meant to eat in nature, because it communicates to us. And if you think about it, why wouldn't the creator make it super easy for us to do? Although digestion and human nutrition is incredibly complex, and how things work on the planet and the nutrients of individual plants that nourish us are incredibly complex, the user system is pretty simple. And it was, yes, I learned that it was seasonal. It was local, it was organic and whole, how we're meant to be eating. But beyond that, I realized, I learned, or I downloaded, whatever it is you want to call, that there's a hierarchy in nature in which nature communicates to us what it is we're meant to be eating. And to me, it made perfect sense whether you believed in God or you were an atheist. The planet was created synergistically with, the species on the planet. And so they actually interconnected and worked together. And if you think about Earth as Gaia, it's like this chain link fence where we're all so intricately connected. And it's like this web, or I think of it like a patchwork quilt, that wraps around the Earth. And as we break a chain or we undo a stitch, we lower our ability to withstand natural disasters and problems in the world. And so what's happening as a species, the human species, the way we're eating is actually killing other species. And we're often concerned about destroying the planet, but the thing that is true, which we're now getting an understanding, is that we're much more likely to be destroying ourselves as a species. The planet will survive. We might take out a lot of species as well, but the planet will survive in some form. What we need to look out for really is how to help ourselves survive as a species. And I remember reading, this is over 30 years ago, that scientists had shown that if we started to eat in a much more sustainable way, the planet actually has the potential to feed 40 billion people, and sustainably, healthily, without killing off other species. And so that really intrigued me. And so if you start to look at how nature tells us what to eat and the quantities to eat it in, by how easily it's obtained in nature, when it's obtained in nature, there is this hierarchy. So that which is most abundant on the planet are the most nourishing things, right? We're meant to have the most of those things. Harder to obtain in nature. They're harder to obtain, so nature makes us work harder for them, but we don't need them as much. And they tend to be the things that are a bit more higher in energy, harder to obtain. And so we work off the corresponding amount of energy obtaining that food as what we would eating it. So that's why there's no obesity in nature, is because there's always this balance. It's almost impossible to gather more food yourself and eat it all and become obese. So, and we worked interdependently as a species, meaning it was much more likely for human survival if we worked with one another. So we had to share food. It was unlikely that we would become obese if we were sharing food. It was really only people who were maybe the cooks who had access to more food, excuse me, than others. I just took in some air. Or if you were like the nobility or a chief and people were feeding you food that you didn't afford for, excuse me. So in excuse me. So in the philosophy of nature's principle, there's a third group of which how we're relating to food is that if you cannot get something in nature, not only do we not need it, it's likely harmful to the body and the planet. And in that, I have a philosophy that I teach in Return to Food that says, or it's an axiom, basically, what's good for the body is good for the planet, and what's good for the planet is good for the body, without exception. So when we start to eat in nature's hierarchy, we diminish our impact on the planet. And one of the things I loved about the Australian Aboriginal culture and their traditional definition of success was they believed that the person who was most successful left no trace of them being on the planet. So they had such a little footprint and impact on the planet that there was no trace that they'd actually been there, with perhaps their body and their bones, which eventually broke down. And we live in a society in that third group. It's part of that kind of philosophy of more and processed and not enough, and building bigger houses or buildings, or having our name plastered around the world, or being famous, wealth, consumerism, all of those things. So this is kind of this mentality of never enough, and it creates really a toxic environment for the planet, very contrary to most Aboriginal cultures. And in fact, if you read Charles Eisenstein's book, Sacred Economics, he talks about how in Aboriginal cultures or Native cultures, that anyone who hoarded a lot of stuff, like hoarded a lot of bread or money, whatever, when other people were going hungry, was considered to have a mental illness. So if we start to look at how nature communicates to us in so many ways, and through our nature, what we know deeply within us is good for us and what isn't good for us, it's always communicating to us. God is always communicating to us through nature and through our own bodies. And when we get present, we start to really resonate and feel and understand, and we'll feel it in our bodies. As anyone will tell you, as they start to move away from a processed diet and connect to a much more natural diet, they start to come alive mentally, emotionally, spiritually, as well as physically. So as I started just a little bit of meditation, I started a little bit of yoga, it started to awaken this spiritual side to me, and more information came to me. So nature, I started to see that nature has this hierarchy in the sense of air is our most abundant nutrient on the planet. And it's everywhere. So if you think about it, we can't survive seconds without it. And when I first started teaching this philosophy in nutrition schools, I would get challenged by students saying, air's not a nutrient. And I would say, well, what's the definition of a nutrient? And people would say, well, that which is required for growth. And I would say, try and grow something within your body without air. So this is really interesting that our most life-dependent nutrient that is required for growth, we don't grow or live without it, is everywhere. In fact, we don't have to move our physical body apart from just taking our diaphragm, and our lungs to take it in. So then if we move to our second most life-dependent nutrient, that is water. It covers 70% of the planet. There's a composite of our bodies being 70% water, and we can't survive days without it. Well, some people have gone days with water fasting, but eventually we do need hydration and water. So then if we start to look at what is our next most available source of nutrients, buddy, I'm working, help me out. Our next most abundant source of nutrients is vegetation. And even amongst vegetation, there's a hierarchy in which nature communicates to us what we're meant to have more of, when we're meant to have it. So it's that whole seasonal thing, what is within season, what is available to us locally is, oh, sorry, distracting me, buddy. Okay. Yeah. So if we look at vegetation and we're given a choice between broccoli seeds or apple seeds, and we're hungry, what are you going to plant if you can only plant one? Well, broccoli is going to sprout faster and have edible sprouts, whereas the apple seed is going to have to grow into a tree, which can take years, right, to grow. And then even once it's produced a tree, it takes years to produce fruit. And so the broccoli is close to the ground. It's most powerful, nutritious, and delicious. You can eat it raw. You can eat it fresh. You can eat it right away. When it's youngest, it's the most powerful. As it ages and matures, it becomes less powerful, less nourishing, and bitter, less palatable. Whereas fruit is the opposite, but it has a shorter growing time. So there's less varieties of fruit than there are vegetables, but it also has a shorter space of time in which it bears fruit for most plants. There's some fruit trees that, like lemons, which can bear fruit, for most of the year. But for the most part, fruit is very seasonal, and you usually have to climb a tree to get it. But even if you don't climb a tree, say it's in a bush, it has to grow to maturity and then ripen before it's palatable. And in the ripening process, that's where most of the nutrients are actually infused into the fruit. And that's why in nature, we eat a lot of these other vegetables while we're waiting for the fruit to grow into maturity and then ripen. And nature rewards us with this beautiful flavor, and because there's more nutrients, there's more, not just vitamins and minerals, but phytochemicals. So the flavor, aroma, and color compounds are developed when it's on the tree. That's why if you have fruit that's picked just when it's mature, but it's not ripened on the tree, and they put it into storage for sometimes up to months, and in some cases even years, and then they ripen it with ethylene gases, because it's no longer connected to the tree, it's not getting those nutrients from the tree. So we're tasting it, and it might be sweet, but if you've ever had that experience where you're choosing to eat an apple because it's healthy and it's good for you, and you're not really enjoying it, even though it's sweet, it's because it hasn't been nourished by the plant and by nature, and it doesn't have this incredibly beautiful experience for us. So nature tells us what to eat and the quantities to eat it in by how easily it's attained in nature. So that which is most abundant, we're meant to have most of, harder to obtain in nature. We require less of it. Nature makes us work harder for it. And if you cannot get it in nature, not only is it harmful to the body, it's harmful to the planet. So that was one of the philosophies that was really significant for me to understand what it is we're meant to be eating and to not be manipulated by marketing companies who were using nutritional marketing, just as I was approached by that company to do. And so I then went on to discover the consumption concept. And the consumption concept is a continuation from nature's principle. And that is nature actually, we would eat incredibly different in nature based on what's easily obtained versus the supermarket. So that which is abundant in nature, we have to work for it. You can't get any food in nature without working for it. It's not like air. It doesn't come to you. We have to go out and get it. So we work it off. But we make decisions based on what is most available. So we often think of we're a lazy species, but the truth is we're actually energy efficient. So we want most bang for a buck. And the great thing is the things that grow most abundantly, the green things in particular, things that stem from green things that are edible plant for the human species, are the things that are most energy nourishing, energizing, and protective. But if you go to what is most readily available in the supermarket, it's not necessarily those things. And the other factor is that when we start to process foods, they become more addictive. And the foods that are harder to attain are naturally more addictive. So what happens is we're set up, predisposed to want things conveniently and things that are addictive to us, because in nature, we have to work harder for it. So we're given stronger physiological desires for it. So a really easy example to kind of illustrate this is there's two things. One, if you're given a choice between dinner tonight, between chicken or an egg, and you're not a vegetarian, what would you say most people would have for dinner? Well, in my experience, most people would go for the chicken. Chicken's more addictive. So if you think about any humans or any animal species that has hormones going through its body, even naturally occurring drugs in nature, it becomes more addictive than a plant food, or for most plant foods. Okay, so, and when I ask audiences, most people will say the chicken. That's the thing that they want the most. And my observation is that it's more addictive than the egg, even though the egg is easier to source. So given the same decision out in nature between going and getting an egg to make dinner or catching, killing, plucking, bleeding, disemboweling, prepare a chicken, well, most people become vegetarian. But even the most hardened carnivore would think twice about killing a chicken that provided a source of eggs. Okay, so we make very different decisions when we're sourcing our own food in nature. And I like to use the consumption concept to ask children about chocolate cake, and how much chocolate cake would they eat, in nature, and if they had to make it themselves. So getting all the ingredients, so getting the flour, separating the germ from the husk, drying it out, threshing it, pounding it into flour, right? And then to make butter, so milking the cow, churning the butter, and you go on through all the ingredients, getting the cacao, breaking it away from the pod, extracting it, pounding it up, the sugar from cane juice, all these things that we would have to go through. You would work off way more energy making that cake than you ever would consuming it. So as you start to look at these things, you start to see that nature, through nature, communicates to us what it is we're meant to be eating. And through our own kind of being and how we're actually being in the planet, we also know that there is also a way, a how in which he wants us to eat. And what I learned very early on is that the further we got away from our nature, our human nature, and eating, and the further we got away from physical nature, that separation was really painful. And it created a lot of discomfort in us. And a lot of the source of that was when we started to have to work for money rather than sourcing our own food and sourcing our own accommodation, and the things that we required for life. We then had to depend on another person to give us money in exchange for our labor. And often we were doing things that weren't actually feeding our soul. They weren't part of our life's purpose, our sacred mission in life. And that created discomfort. So then as we started to process our food, and those foods were processed in the same way we take drugs and process them. So refined sugar is made in very similar ways to how opium sap is turned into heroin and how coca leaves is turned into cocaine. So very similar processes. You end up with a pure white substance at the end of it. And in their natural state, they're not, even though they might have opiates in it or they might spike our blood sugar, they're not highly addictive or toxic. But in their refined states, as we consume a lot of them or ingest a lot of them, they become toxic and addicted to the human body. And we're seeing now that brain scans are showing that refined sugar lights up the brain's dopamine receptors 8 times more than cocaine. So, and it's not just refined sugars, it's anything that you take from a natural substance to a pure white substance. Refined sugars, oils, salts, grains, and chemicals, and any food on the planet you can turn into what I call the lethal recipe. And any culture that started to import this addictive, malnourishing food, because all the nutrients were removed in order to get it into a white substance, they're removing all the macro and micronutrients, so the vitamins and minerals and the phytochemicals. So it is essentially just a pure drug, and it's not nourishing, energizing, protective. So the body's eating a volume of this food. It's addictive, so we're getting a buzz. But because it's toxic to the body, we're not only getting that plunge in our blood sugar levels, but it's impacting the body in negative ways. And so we feel uncomfortable when we're doing this. And then what we do is we tend to have the same substance to give us the high and to the kind of the opposite extreme of the corresponding low. So for most of you who have ever experienced, emotional eating or depression, we rarely sit on the couch crying and consoling ourselves with a big bowl of raw broccoli or carrots, right? It's not the thing. We're choosing to soothe ourselves with food. And one of the other things that happens with the lethal recipe that makes it all the more powerful is we're becoming more and more disconnected as a species. So we are sitting in front of a computer. My preference would be to have all of you in my living room. Hopefully we could all fit comfortably, and I could be sharing this information with you and we could interact in person. But the more and more we actually do this and we don't fill our lives with interaction with other people, and the more we eat on our own in front of our computers or over a sink or a counter, or admittedly, I've done in front of my computer in my bed. It's crazy. But the more we do that, if we don't have enough of those meaningful exchanges around, sharing the meal or even just sharing life, it creates a level of discomfort that just encourages us or draws us to seek comfort through behaviors or substances, which then become addictive. And we have this negative cycle of addiction. So one of the things that I truly believe is that there is kind of God's plan and there's man's plan. And what I've seen consistently with the scientific approach to food and breaking it down into its macro and micronutrients is that there's almost like this ego of man thinks they can improve on nature. And when I've looked at anything under close scrutiny, is that I truly believe that nature is infinitely more intelligence than man's consciousness right now. We can tap into it. I believe we can tap into it by actually connecting and hooking into nature. But I don't believe we're at the stage now where we know more than nature. And the smartest cultures and the people who actually use science to harness nature rather than trying to control nature, they're the ones who are having the greatest success with not only nourishing humans and other species, but the planet, okay, without the negative side effects of things like genetic modification or overprocessing of our food. So inspired eating really is about tapping into nature, our nature as a human species, understanding how we're meant to be eating as the human species, and understanding how it is that the human species thrives. And one of the things that we know is that we are a social, interdependent species. We thrive when we are social and when we work together. So we are actually meant to eat together. And as we create more and more separation from the context of eating, I remember reading this almost 30 years ago that one of the reasons they suspected part of the reason that the Roman Empire fell was due to the breakdown of the family unit. And we're starting to see that now where people separate. The evening meal is incredibly a rarity where the whole family gets together and eats. And the cultures that actually eat together have, and particularly in a healthy manner, there's, lots of ways you can actually eat together as a family that's destructive. But if we can actually start to eat together in a way where we are connected, where we're giving thanks for our food, where we're present and we're mindful and conscious about what we're eating, not just, the meal we're having, but if we can prepare it together and prepare it from love and source our food from love, I believe that's really how our Creator would like us to be eating. That we actually build the strength of the family unit. And just one of the studies that comes to mind is happiness researcher Shauna Kaur has a study that shows that you can take a child that is predisposed genetically to pessimism, and by getting them at the evening meal to share 3 things that they're grateful for, and to do this consistently, you can then turn that child predisposed to depression and pessimism into a lifelong optimist. Now, I often say that I would much rather have a greasy bowl of noodles with people who are kind, positive, loving, and upbuilding, and of course, grateful, than to have the most nutritiously gourmet prepared meal with people who are angry, depressed, and negative. Now, of course, that makes perfect sense, but what the seed I want to plant in you is to consider to have food that is nourishing, energizing, protective, that actually tastes good, and share it with people who you care, respect, and love. And when you start to have this piece where you understand what it is we're meant to be eating in nature, in the hierarchy, how nature actually develops it and gives it to us, and how God actually speaks to us, and we can actually share that in a social way, that we're really connected to one another, that we actually have the power to not just shift and change our own lives and step into our own personal power, to use, the New Age terms, which I do believe that we're all given a gift and an impulse in the world, something that gives us meaning, a service. And when we're engaged in our life, when we're awake and we're living in a healthy vessel of our soul, that everything thrives and we're able to make a more significant contribution to the world. And so, of course, there's many things that I would love to share with you tonight. And I'm just really kind of scratching the surface and giving you an overview of how I believe God wants us to eat. He wants us to eat in accordance to nature. He wants us to eat in a way that actually gives us pleasure. There's a reason why food tastes good. It's not just the things that are hard to obtain in nature. They're things that are most abundant in nature that actually taste delicious. And when we move away from what I call this lethal recipe, and our palate starts to refine, it actually becomes cleaner, we taste this deliciousness of nature. It really awakens us, all our senses. And as a result, you will start to feel better. You're going to start to think better. You're going to sleep better. And it's going to impact every single area of your life. So relationships, business, and your health, it can't help but impact all of those things. So I'm kind of at the end of my time. And what I just want to do is there's 5 things that I know consistently when I'm working with people and working with groups, to help them start to get to the path of not just returning to eating real food from processed food, but to get to the place where they're starting to develop a healthier emotional relationship with food, and then a more inspired, a way of eating and relating to food, our body, and the planet, where we're connected to source and spirit and energy and nature, of how we're connected. There are 5 things that I really encourage you to do, and you can take action today, right? So one of the things is you need to start to listen to your body, and that's part of the awareness process. So the awareness process is you want to be aware of what you're eating that is disconnected from nature, which is ultimately going to make you sick. And start to become aware of not just what you're eating, so the sugars and the refined foods, the lethal recipe, but how it impacts your body, right? And also another piece of the awareness piece is how does it actually, how are you triggered, to eat certain things that aren't serving you? What are the environments that when you're in it, you actually want to eat healthy? And what are the environments or the things you're exposed to that when you're exposed to it or you're in that environment, just want to make you eat terrible things that aren't going to serve you or your body or the planet? So awareness is really important. Understand nature, and your nature is the human species and how you're meant to interact with the planet. Okay. And the other piece is begin before you're ready. So it's really important that you don't wait until that point of being ready. It is in the doing that you get ready. Okay, really important to understand that piece. And community. So one of the things we know that drives addiction, and for anyone who's addicted to processed food or is eating food out of context of nature, you're going to have a level of addiction. We know the research is showing that it's not just about eating addictive substances, is that when you're in a supportive community, you know, that social context that's upbuilding, that's supportive and kind and loving, we don't have the same issues with food or drug addiction or behavioral addictions. It's only when we're separate from that and understanding how amazing our body is and amazing, you know, our souls are, and how amazing this relationship is that we have with food, our body, and the planet. So, so it's basically listen to your body, become aware, understand nature, and get nourished. So not just in food, right? Not just taking out toxic things like the lethal recipe and introducing, you know, seasonal, local, organic, and whole food in the context of nature. But understanding that we can be malnourished mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And what I found with working with people is when we started to remove the toxicity mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, and we started to nourish them mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, the changes that they made in the physical were so much easier, long-term, and sustainable. So understand that we need to be nourished mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And the last thing that I'm going to leave you with today is a gift that I promised at the beginning of the session, and that is I have something called the Sweet Freedom 7-Day Eat Less Sugar Challenge. Now, you can apply it to everything within the lethal recipe, or you can just decide to just start by tackling sugar, because it is our #1 and most dangerous drug addiction on the planet right now. And if you want to sign up for that, it's a $37 program where you'll get videos, a video each day, an audio each day, and a PDF that really helps and guides you through the process of getting off of sugar. And it will truly, we believe, help you lead towards your sweet freedom. And all you have to do is go to Sweet Freedom, SWEET, freedom, as in free, .ca, because it's a Canadian website. And you just have to sign up there for that, and it's free, and we'd love to see you in an incredibly supportive community. So that is really what I wanted to share with you. I believe that we have a wonderful and benevolent creator who wants the best for us. And that when we tap into what he's actually given to us and the hierarchy in which he's given to us, and that it is not only good for us, our bodies, and the planet, that it will also help us serve what is, I believe, our highest purpose in the world, which is to somehow serve. And that brings me back to Mindalia TV and Myrna, because, you know, when I spoke to you and spoke to Angel, I know that definitely the whole thing really is about service, right? It's really about making the world a better place, and that's what makes us the happiest. Oh.
Thank you, Sherry, for sharing. So valuable. You know, it's very impressive, all that you have to say. It's definitely worth spreading. We're gonna go with the Q&A section. But before going there, we want to remind you, to the audience, that if you want to help people like you getting access to all this content, there's a couple of things you can do just by liking this video, sharing with the people you know, subscribing to our channel, or just leaving us a positive comment down below. That is the way in which this platform helps us reach out to as many people as possible, and we're gonna make it happen. We're changing the world. We're spreading this knowledge. And before also, we want to remind you that there is the chat. The chat is on the side of your screen, and you can make your questions before the Q&A section is over. And let's start with it. Sherry, I'm going to give you the screen one more time, and I'm going to be reading the questions to you, okay?
Okay, great.
You hear me well?
I hear you well.
Perfect. And let's start with this one. It was at the beginning of the talk during this context. It says, using more energy to get more food. Can you elaborate that?
Yes. So if you think about the things that are most easily obtained in nature, things like the green, the leaves, you know, the vegetables, you basically have to bend down to get them, you know, and just gather them. I have a little garden. I'm horticulturally challenged, severely challenged, but I'm learning how to grow things. And it's really good for you to kind of get down on your haunches, you know, or to kneel down, or to, you know, do like the chair pose in nature to get the vegetables, but it doesn't require a lot of energy. Whereas if you're wanting to get something like nuts from the tree, imagine trying to open up an almond, like just one almond. I remember the first time I tried to open an almond, it took me about 10 minutes. Now, of course, you get faster the more you did it, but you would be eating an almond that it comes out without the dark kind of the peel. It comes out just the white little pulpy flesh. So to eat, you know, 20 almonds, there's actually a bit of work. Even if you got good at it, there's still a bit of work to do it. And so it's not something in nature you probably would do, you know, do as much as gathering the stuff that's most readily and easily obtained, you know. And if you extrapolate that on and thinking about making a loaf of bread, to grow the wheat, to gather the wheat, to thresh the wheat, to dry the wheat, to then, you know, take it out of the husk and then grind the wheat, you're using a lot of energy making that. So it would be very hard in nature to do all of that and eat so much bread, because then you need to store it, you need to bake it, you know, there's a you know, a lot of energy that's expended. And that's why we don't have the problem with obesity in nature. It's very unusual. It's because nature has us work off in the corresponding energy and the things that are most abundant or most nutritious for us. Is that sufficient in the explanation, or do you need clarification beyond that?
Well, I think it answers very well what the question was. I hope it is. Next question is, why isn't this information shared by the government?
Sorry. And I think it's really understandable that we believe that the government is set up to help us. And I'll tell you, there's many people who work within government who want to help us. There's no doubt there are good people within government. But probably the bigger overarching thing is that governments really aren't just the voice of the people. They're controlled by business. They're controlled by industry. And if you look at lobbyists, you know, just alone lobbyists and how they actually get things passed through government, these companies are so wealthy, they can hire, you know, 10 lobbyists to every one person who has to work within that governing body to make a decision to say yes or no. So not only are they funded in many ways, you know, politically or elsewhere, many subversive ways. So I learned that very early on in university, that the university was controlled by industry. And that's why most dietitians that come out of a university have very much a food industry bias or a pharma bias. They're really not biased towards us eating, as I'm speaking about, in accordance to nature. So it's not that I believe governments are bad. I just believe the system's basically rigged and run by industry. And I learned that very quickly in my role as the Victorian Chair of Nutrition Australia and speaking at dietitians conferences and consulting to the government and seeing how things were run. Change was never going to come from the government. It had to come from a grassroots place, and change will only come in the food industry when we stop buying the foods that are making us and the planet sick.
Thank you. That was a very good answer. And let's continue. We have, what do you think about the ozone therapy?
Ozone therapy? So I haven't done enough research on it, but here's one of the things I notice consistently about when man tries to replicate nature. Nature is always superior in it, and that the delivery mechanism that nature provides things in a healthy environment is far superior. So I think in the situations of illness, if you can only access, you know, something where they've mimicked nature for healing, that it's better than not having it. But I still think you have to be careful, because not all companies are thinking long term. It's not that they aren't altruistic and they don't want to have something that actually cures people. It's just that what I've often seen, whether it's ozone therapy, you know, or far infrared, or even just dietary supplements and things like that, they might solve one problem, but if they're not doing it in a sustainable way, they're creating more problems than they're solving. So a simple example is like water filters. Great to get filtered water to, you know, filter out the pharmaceutical drugs and toxins that are in a typical tap water. But what happens is that these water filters are often made in countries, third world countries, where the people in that country are then subjected to environmental problems because of the mechanization and the resourcing of materials and what it does to actually create those water filters. And those water filters create, you know, problems with the environment of having to recycle filters and all those things that really could be mitigated just by going to Spring Finder and getting your own spring water. So with all natural therapies, I think we need to look at, in severe cases of healing when we can't access nature's solution to it, that they can be useful and helpful. But I think, as Aristotle said, nature does nothing uselessly. It's far more superior and intelligent. And I think one of the biggest things that we don't take into consideration is many of these healing pieces of equipment or supplements are basically created to compensate for the fact that we're actually eating and living in a way that's not sustainable. It's separated from nature. And if we just eliminated the behaviors that are creating the toxicity and the separation from nature, and we just reconnected to nature, you know, got out and moved, got some sunshine, because sunshine is a nutrient for us. It's not this big, bad, evil thing. And that as we start to nourish ourselves with living foods, particularly fruits and vegetables, it actually becomes our protection against the negative impacts of the sun. So we just have to tap into nature, avoid the lethal recipe that disconnects us from nature and makes us sick. And it will require us to make less things that are just treating the symptoms rather than taking us to the source of healing.
Thank you. That was really awesome. That's let's go with the next one. How can we free ourselves from the addictions we already have?
So great question. I love this question because you're not just looking at the diet solution, because most of our foods are made like drugs. So they're highly addictive like drugs. And so it requires a strategy, not a diet. And so within that strategy, we need to start to look at ourselves as a whole being, a mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical being, not just a physical being that's, you know, addicted to a physical substance. So the first thing we know about addiction right now is we need to get into community. We need to be in a supportive community, one that shares our philosophy, one that is positive and healing, because there are many communities out there that are judgmental and gossip and, you know, are looking at the negative things in the world. We need to start to look at what is good about our world, what is healing about our world, and we need to tap into that. We need to be heard and have a platform for being heard and contributing without, you know, going into that negativity and victimhood, because that's not where we're going to heal. You might need a therapist for that piece. And then you need to start to work at where are you toxic mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically, and start to remove those toxins. It doesn't have to happen overnight unless, of course, you're in severe chronic pain or you have a terminal illness diagnosis, right? But for most of us who aren't facing those things and we just want to not be addicted to something, we want to have that freedom, that sweet freedom that I talk about. It's just about doing one thing each day. And when that one thing, so for many people, it's just drinking more water, finding spring water, you know, or getting spring water delivered from a true spring. And every day just hydrating yourself. And then one day when that just becomes how you do life, you're going to start to work on, you know, removing something that's really toxic in your life. So that might be an influence, you know, it might be something you're watching or reading or listening to. It might be a group that you're hanging around with that's, you know, just creating this very negative kind of cloud over your body. And when you connect to people who are lifting the energy of the planet, you know, and they're trying to be part of the solution without, you know, making other people wrong or bad, and you disconnect from that which is toxic, and that's so that mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, you will start to see that those addictive substances, because addiction is just a way of self-soothing. It's just, you know, in many ways, it's not just disconnection from other species or other humans, or as, you know, my cat that's crying. It gives us, you know, it gives us a sense of not being alone. as we connect to that which is greater than us, through meditation, through prayer, through being out in nature, through communing with other people, the substances have less and less of a hold on us. And then when we start to nourish, energize, and protect ourselves by eating foods abundant in nature, we start to get this flush of well-being, and we get these calm moods, and we reach homeostasis within our blood sugar levels, and our brain is no longer having this toxic influence in it. So it starts to think more clearly, feel better. We start to sleep better. We wake up better. We have even moods throughout the day. And then addiction just slowly loses its grip and its hold on us. Saying that, I am not a purist. So I believe that chocolate is God's way of saying he loves us and wants us to be happy. And I'd rather have 100 years on the planet with chocolate than 120 without it. So I think we have beautiful things on the planet to enjoy. But addiction is different. We're not really enjoying the substance. We're just using it as a way of self-soothing and avoiding really connecting with our life.
Thank you. We have the following question. It says, I love the idea of eating plant-ripened food, and I do grow my own every year, but I can't grow enough even during the season of growing. How can we get food or good food during off-season or in time of need?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's one of the reasons why, if you think about real estate, what did they say the first three things about investing in real estate are? Location, location, location. So a big part of where you are is trying to use the resources within what you have. And I certainly don't consume what I grow. Like, I would starve if I was dependent. It sounds like you're growing a lot more than I am. So I rely on farmers markets and throughout the winter months when there's no part of the year where I'm actually growing enough. I have a garden. I just don't have the gift yet. I'm working on it. So what I do is I rely on farmers markets most of the year. And the other things that you can do is get a co-op, get a community shared agriculture. That's where you basically sign up and you pay a farmer, a certain amount each month, or sometimes in advance, and they know they're getting this certain income coming in. And as a result of that, they give you more than you would normally get at a grocery store or even a farmer's market. And then you can start to skill share with other people. So maybe there's, they say one fruit tree is enough to produce enough fruit for 4 families. So if you have a fruit tree in your backyard and someone else has a fruit tree, and you can start to, collect and gather with your neighbors and share your resources. The most important thing to do, and I applaud you for gardening, is just to set the intention of finding food at its most nourishing, energizing, protective, and supporting organic, farmers, and even more so biodynamic farmers who are growing things not just with the absence of chemicals, but they're really harnessing nature and working with nature than trying to control and improve it.
Thank you, Sherry. We have a question. It says, do you have a book? When can we all learn all your lessons? I know that you said already your website, but if you could repeat it, please.
Yeah, sure. So I have a book that's called Return to Food, and it's now out of print, but it's in the process of being edited for the 2nd edition. So that should be coming out later in this year. But what I do have is, and I'm working on 2 books. One is Sweet Freedom, which is a memoir of my journey through sugar addiction. And then the last book that I'm working on right now is called Inspired Eating, How God Wants Us to Eat, which will be coming out. So if you're interested in any of those things, and I've created online programs based on all of those things, you can go to returntofood.com or sweetfreedom.ca. That sweetfreedom.ca is where you'll find that 7-day Eat Less Sugar Challenge for free. And Return to Food is where you'll find the 7-day Return to Food Challenge, which is much more comprehensive, and that's a paid program. And then we have an 8-week online program where we actually get you into community to help you get off of sugar, and that goes through the full process that I've developed and have helped many people, thousands of people, beat their sugar addiction with.
Thank you, Sherry. The next question says, should we give our pets those packed processed food, or does this apply as well to them?
Yeah, so it applies just as much to them. So I have a vet that came to visit Billy Cart, my Burmese, and he's 17 years old, and he couldn't believe how good he looks for 17. He's definitely got some issues, you know, and they have longevity issues. They're just, you know, they have limitations to their physicality, but he's been raised on raw food. So when I was in Australia, he had raw kangaroo, and here in Canada, now that he's with me in Canada, he has raw venison, and we can get raw kangaroo and vegetables. If you think about any animal, there's no such thing as an animal on the planet that eats cooked food in nature. It's only a construct of man. And what we find is, as we feed our pets human food, cooked food, you know, and highly processed food, and in particular, most pet food on the planet is from diseased and toxic animals. So animals that have had, you know, pharmaceutical drugs in them, antibiotics, things like that, that don't break down when they're cooked and processed. So they're still in that. Many of these animals are fed unnatural diets. So remember, you eat what you eat eats. So your animal is eating a diseased, toxic carcass that's lived a miserable life, and that's not good for anyone on the planet. So try and source a diet that's as close to what you could possibly get for them in nature. Now, I'm not going out killing mice. That would be ideal. Or birds for my cat. But the next best thing is to source raw food for your animals. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very important. And we're almost reaching the end. There's a couple more questions. They're asking, is there any baby formula that doesn't have sugar or other harmful ingredients that you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I think for a time, I know that Dr. Mercola on his site was selling an infant formula. And I think probably if I was to look at one, I would trust him more than most. But one of the things I probably would suggest is to go more towards trying to find raw goat's milk, because that's easier on the body than cow's milk for the human baby. There's things of finding wet nurses, so other mothers who are producing milk. There are mothers, you know, who now are actually producing breast milk and selling it and shipping to people frozen. And to me, that's going to be a far superior thing for your child than formula. Yeah, so if you can, I think probably one of the biggest things is start to do your research before conception to get your body in a state where it's going to be healthy and nourished. That's why if you look at many cultures, when a woman became pregnant, she started to eat a different diet because intuitively they knew they had to stock her body up, because producing a human and then feeding a human takes so much out of a woman that you want to be nourishing prior to conception, during, you know, gestation, and while you're breastfeeding. You want to make sure that you're taken care of so that you have, you know, the biggest chance to actually feed your baby, because breast milk is so, you know, there's nothing that can touch on it compared to anything we can produce on the planet so far.
Thank you. We have the following questions. Are there any kind of restaurants that you know that are out there and they know all of this?
I don't know about all of this. I think you can go to raw food restaurants. There's lots of, you know, vegan places now. I think they're probably the ones that are most in sync, but also understand that a lot of vegetarian and vegan places, what happens with a lot of people is once they will give up meat, which is addictive, they swap it for another addictive substance. Just like if you look at cocaine and heroin addicts, the number one substance they go to is the same thing that vegans go to, and that's refined sugar. So it's a process of finding restaurants who understand how we're meant to be eating in nature. And if in doubt, you know, try and find places that really respect whatever produce they're getting, whatever animals they're feeding you, and aren't pumping the food up with a bunch of sugar to compensate for the fact that, you know, either they don't have the correct chef skills or understanding of human nutrition. Juliet Child said it best, to find a restaurant, and that's why I actually think a lot of the farm-to-table restaurants get it, and you just avoid the things that have high sugar in it. But Julia Child said, in all things nutrition, consider cuisine, and in all things cuisine, consider nutrition. And I think finding that balance in a restaurant is where we'll find our happy place.
That's beautiful. Well, and finally, this is like the $1 million question. It says, how about coffee and other caffeine products?
Yeah. Okay, so great question. I think coffee's right in there with chocolate, and that it's God's way of saying he loves us and wants us to be happy. And in its natural state, it has lots of nutrients. And that's what the coffee companies want you to know. And the research is based on coffee in its natural state. Once we roast it, though, it develops what we call AGEs and acrylamide, which is a known carcinogen. Okay, AGEs are advanced glycated end products. Anytime we roast things from, that natural color to a brown or black color, it creates these AGEs, advanced glycated end products that age us. So I'm of the belief that I get a lot of joy from coffee. To me, I'm very aware that it's a drug. It has a drug-like reaction in my body, and I have one every second day. And what I try and do is make sure the bulk of what I'm doing is nourishing, energizing, protective, so it actually compensates and makes up for the damage that's actually happening from that cup of coffee. And what it does for me, having it every second day, is that there's two things that are significant that happens. One is I don't crave it like when I have it every single day, like I have to have it. So if I have it every second day, it's a treat, and it's something that I enjoy just for that process. It's not something that I'm required to have to either wake me up or, get me through the day. And the other thing is that I notice if I have coffee every single day, my complexion, it starts to show. It has this ruddy kind of complexion. So my vanity and my sense of well-being keeps my consumption low, but if you're consuming it, they say over 3 cups a day. And one of the people who did my Sweet Freedom program, she was having 6 pots of coffee a day. What will happen is that's going to create a lot of pressure and toxicity within your body. Your body's going to create fat cells to store that excess toxicity away from your internal organs. And if you're super fit and have a low body percentile and it's not able to actually create those fat cells, it's going into your vital organs. So with anything that has a toxic, load on the body, you want to make sure that the coffee, even its organic state, it's going to have an impact on your body. But if it's exposed to chemicals in processing or in the growing, that makes it a really toxic substance. So you want to find the most natural, organic version of it, and then start to consume it mindful of the fact that it does have detrimental effects to the body.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The last one. This is the last one for for sure. Earlier you were talking about the oxygen and water being also nutrition, right?
Mm-hmm.
How
Yes.
about the things that are in contact with our skin, like beauty products, among other
yeah.
things, about like air fresheners, that type of things? What is your
Yeah.
approach on that?
Oh, well, look, if you can't make it in nature, it's not meant to be consumed or on our body. So when it comes to, makeup or body products, if eating it will make you sick, putting it on your body will make you sick. So that's one of the reasons I stopped dyeing my hair, is I say my conscience grew louder than my vanity. When I realized that hair dyes and nail polishes, particularly hair dyes, actually permeate the blood-brain barrier. If you think about our skin is a porous organ, it's the largest organ on the body. And unlike if you eat something, so if I ate sunscreen, it would taste horrible, but I have enzymes in my mouth that actually help break it down and deal with it. But I would never eat it. I can't even stand the smell of it on my body. But when you put it on your skin, there's a few things that happen. One, there's no barrier, right? There's no enzymes to break it down. So it can actually get directly into your bloodstream, just like if you have a hormone patch or something like that. It goes directly into your bloodstream through your skin. So if you have sunscreen that is made with nanotechnology, those particles go right into our bloodstream. And what we're seeing now, just using sunscreen as an example, is that our use of sunscreen has increased at the same rate our skin cancer rates have increased. So at the very least, it's not helping. And it can be quite possibly construed as it's contributing to skin cancer. And here's why. One, you're putting something that you'd never make in nature, that you never put on your tongue, on your skin. It's inhibiting your body from absorbing vitamin D, which we know vitamin D is required for preventing cancer. And one of the biggest contributors to cancer is the lack of vitamin D. And then you're putting on this chemical and you're baking it into your body in the sun. And the biggest piece is your body has this protective mechanism to protect you against everything. It communicates to you. And one of its way of saying you're getting too much sun is it burns. And it's like, ouch, that hurts. I better get out of the sun. So instead, what we humans do is we go, we'll just turn that off and we'll put some sunscreen and we'll stay in the sun longer than we would in a natural environment, or we won't cover ourselves up as we would in a natural environment or sit under a tree. So we've got all these forces that, and that's just one thing. So you think about what we put on our hair, on our face, nails, the clothing in our body. So synthetics actually, if they have unnatural dyes, they actually breathe into our skin. So it really is everything, and it can really overwhelming. And I know when I first started studying this, I just wanted to throw my hands up in the air and not do anything, just sit on the couch and eat ice cream until I exploded. But that's not going to help me. It's not going to help the planet. And so it's just a matter of one day at a time, taking one step at a time. The next time you go to the grocery shop and your makeup's run out, try a mineral-based. They're naturally based, makeups. Try and just use coconut oil instead of, expensive skin creams. There's lots of natural things that you can put on your tongue. And if you can put it on your tongue, you can put it on your body. And when the salt runs out, instead of getting the table salt, you get a natural sea salt. It's just, we just start to slowly, one step at a time, integrate this in how we do life, look at the labels, get rid of the stuff that's the lethal recipe, and start to introduce things that are most natural. It can happen. But it's a great thing and question to arise because it's very much connected.
Thank you. That's definitely very, very, very useful. We have reached the end of our Q&A segment. And he's welcome. He's welcome to meow as much as he wants.
Hold on.
Yes, let us see him.
There we go.
Oh my God. He's beautiful.
He's a big old beautiful man.
Aww.
He's a grumpy old man with sharp nails.
Well, he's now a celebrity.
That's what he wanted.
Exactly. You know how they are. All they want is to be noticed. He wanted us to know who's the boss.
That's it. Yeah.
Sherry, we want to thank you. All that knowledge that you shared with us today. It is very valuable, and we're thankful that we had you today. Before letting you go, we want to have you say one final advice to our audience and goodbye.
Well, I just want to say thank you for hosting, and I thank you for your mission. It's beautiful, and I'm totally on board, and I love it, and I feel like it's an honor to being invited. So I want to say that. And this talk really is about, inspired eating and how God wants us to eat. And if there's anything about it that you're overwhelmed with, meditate, pray, ask for guidance as to what's the most easy and logical next step to take, and then take that step. And when that becomes how you do life, ask for guidance, direction, and take the next step. And get into community that supports it. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, to our audience, on behalf of the Mindalia TV team, we want to thank you for joining us today. We want to also remind you that if you want to help other people like you, just click like this video, leave us a positive comment down below, or share this with the people you love that can benefit from the content that we shared today. One more time, thank you. And thank you, Sherry, for being with us today. And goodbye. Until next time.
Bye-bye.